So we're in Logan, and if you take a short trip 470 miles north of here, you end up very close to the Canadian border and at the Haskell Basin watershed. It's a small watershed just outside of Whitefish, but it's a really important one. It provides the city of Whitefish with their water supply. The picture on the right is a picture of the basin. The picture on the left is a map. I point out these pink lands that are outlined in red are private forest lands, and it's where the water supply is located. It supplies the vast majority of Whitefish's municipal water supply out of 2 intake facilities on the stream and pipe down to the reservoir where they have a water treatment plant, and then to provide the city. Originally, the city of Whitefish was established as a railroad stop on the Great Northern Railroad. And in fact, when the city was constructed, they cut down the forest to build the town. And so its nickname is Stump Town because some of the first residents' views were just all the stumps that they had left over when they built the town. Like many communities in the West, it has changed to where now it's known as a 4-season tourist destination. It's got Glacier Park sitting on its doorstep. Whitefish Mountain Resort city sits at the base of that, and Flathead Lake just south of there. And trails and fishing and all sorts of activities around the community. The center of that watershed that I showed you in pink is owned by H Stoltz Land and Lumber Company. They're the oldest wood products company in Montana. They're a small, private, family-held company that manages about 40,000 acres in the greater Flathead Valley. They're a big deal in our community because they have a mill that employs 120 workers, and they produce about 70 million board feet of lumber per year. And they're really valued in the community because they're viewed as good land stewards, and for that century they've always had their land open and available for public recreation and doing things above and beyond for the community. One of those things that they did way back when is when the city of Whitefish first established their city water supply, they built the diversions and the piping systems on Stoltz land with nothing more than a handshake. There were no legal documents authorizing the city to have those diversions on the streams or to have the pipelines on the Stoltz land or to manage and maintain those facilities for the city into the future. On top of that, there was significant development right on the border of that property with $1 million homes going in around Whitefish Mountain Resort. It's one of the fastest growing communities in the Intermountain West. It's one of the top 10 fastest growing communities in Montana. And you can see those houses are literally right on the border of these watersheds. And there was a big demand for that to continue. The developers were dying to buy that land and put in more $1 million homes and make a bunch of money for the city. And in fact, the Stoltz Company had been doing that for the past 20 years. They had sold on all of those developments that went around Whitefish Mountain Resort. They had sold 3 of the parcels that were the biggest subdivisions, almost 1,200 acres that had contributed to that development around the resort. So a lot of economic pressure for the company to continue that development through the watershed. And the threat of that development was real because historically the city had 3 water diversions up there, and development in the 1970s actually caused contamination of one of those streams with both E. coli and sedimentation, and the city had to close down that. So instead of 3 intakes, they were down to 2. additional development up there, even if they could get a deal with the infrastructure, could potentially threaten the water supply for the city. And then the sticker shock with $1 million homes on your doorstep. The value of that 3,000 acres was almost $23 million. So what are we going to do? As you've heard many times today, partnership was the key to make this happen with the City of Whitefish, Montana Fish, Life and Parks, the Trust for Public Lands, the landowner Stoltz, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and Whitefish Legacy Partners, which is a local trail group up there that has done a lot of recreational trail development and really added to the economy and the opportunities there. Our solution was a conservation easement on the Stoltz land. For those of you that don't know, a conservation easement is simply a legal voluntary agreement that's binding with the landowner, between the landowner and either a government agency or a local land trust that can hold those easements to protect specific conservation values that are defined in the document. For ours, the conservation easements also include measures to protect wildlife habitat and to secure public access into the future, and they are permanent. They run with the land. If Stoltz was ever to sell this land, the easement stays in place forevermore, so those restrictions are permanent. The easement alone was $20 million. Stoltz offered to sell it for 16.7, which gave us some matching value that we could use to apply for those 2 federal grants from the Forest Service Forest Legacy Program and Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species Recovery Grants to help pay for that. We were still nearly $8 million short. The city of Whitefish floated a bond, and their residents voted to increase their resort tax by 1% to help pay the remainder of that, because getting water off the mountain and filtered and clean is a lot more effective than pumping it out of the lake and treating it at a much higher expense. So the key, one of the questions earlier today was about partnerships and making it work. The key, as I saw it, is in this partnership, finding something to benefit each of the partners. It's not so much a compromise as simply working really hard to find solutions that met everybody's needs. So for the Stoltz family, they continue to own and manage the land for their core business practice is timber production, and they continue to do that. So these logs continue to feed their mills and keep their business running. For the city, obviously, they got secure agreements that give them access to the water and the infrastructure delivering it. The Forest Service is, in the Forest Legacy Program, is interested in conserving lands that are threatened by development. This clearly did that for them. The Fish and Wildlife Service was focused on endangered species. We have grizzly bears on the property. Fish, Life, and Parks was for about public recreation and fish and wildlife habitat. We had all of that in spades on the property as well. The Whitefish Legacy Partners actually got a new trail route that runs from the city of Whitefish up to the Whitefish Mountain Resort. So it's a single track trail through the forest that gives the community an opportunity for another access route to the resort without driving up the road. So a lot of people wonder when I give this talk, why is a wildlife management agency investing in projects like this? A couple of years ago, we hired a consultant and developed a brand for our agency to try to encapsulate what it is we do that's important to the public. And they came up with this tagline, "The outside is in us all." And at first it was kind of hokey to me, but I started thinking about it. It really does encapsulate what Fish, Life, and Parks as an agency is focused on, is providing outdoor recreation experiences. But more importantly than that, for all of you that are involved in those kinds of things, whatever your special interest is, it's a deep-seated passion that you really care a lot about, and it's part of your identity, who you are and what you do. And our agency really focuses on recreation and outdoor experiences that help address that for everybody. So for me, it was a perfect fit. And we've been doing these kinds of things for a really long time. This isn't new to our agency. Our first state park was purchased in 1935. Our first wildlife conservation area was 1940, at a time when big game populations were just starting to recover and really expand across the landscape. They summer on the public lands in the high elevations in the west, and they winter on private lands. And our strategy in Montana was to allow them to continue those migrations and living on those lands at the low elevations, but we actually purchased some of those key parcels so that those animals would have a place to winter and those migrations would continue through time. So currently, as an agency, we have over 500,000 acres of private land under conservation easement that secure those wildlife habitat values and public recreation opportunities, and we have almost 500,000 acres under fee ownership that we manage exclusively for those purposes. And our conservation easements are part of 2 million acres of conservation easement in Montana across the state. Ours are this color of purple that we hold, and these red ones are all other organizations. As I mentioned, the red ones are 1.5 million acres. And you can see it really fills in a matrix nicely of the yellow BLM lands and the green Forest Service lands, starting to put together a patchwork of landscape that is meaningful on a landscape scale and filling in some of those gaps with private land ownership. Collaboration, as you've heard multiple times, is the key to our success, to work with a variety of different organizations, trying to link these various projects together, finding solutions to everybody's needs, creating financial partnerships, and then using those partnerships to build on success. You'll notice this is the Haskell Basin project. Up above that in the rest of the watershed is Forest Service land. The Stoltz and the City of Whitefish and the Flathead National Forest and a sister agency, Department of Natural Resources, worked together on a stewardship plan for the Forest Service lands in the upper reaches of the watershed to try to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire and maintain that functional watershed. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks worked with the Trust for Public Lands and Stoltz to do another conservation easement on another 7,000 acres right next door. And then we worked with other partners, including Trust for Public Lands, for that blue chunk was another 13,000 acre conservation easement. And currently, with the Trust for Public Lands and Stoltz, that little orange piece up there is another 1,000 acre conservation easement that we're working on, as all building on this success from Haskell Basin. So for an agency perspective, we do that to focus on fish and wildlife habitat, public recreation opportunities. But for me, the real key is trying to stitch together these landscapes so that we have conservation on a meaningful scale, linking private lands and public lands together in a fashion that serve these multiple needs into the future. For current generations, obviously, but a real focus is on future generations as well. These lands and the landscapes will be in place and functioning so that future generations can enjoy the same kinds of things that we've been enjoying for a really long time. And with that, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions.
So we have maybe closer to 10 minutes for questions. Go ahead.
So across your extended, maybe aspirational real estate portfolio, you guys, I guess it's a two-part question. Would you characterize the ratio of sort of opportunism and planning looking at, and do you have a formal, like an algorithm or some kind of structure to help you decide what to keep, buy, or sell?
Once we buy it, it's really hard to sell it. Publicly, people get attached to it, and also there are laws restricting to that. It really is a balance between priorities and opportunities. We have the State Wildlife Action Plan that identifies specific areas of the landscape in Montana that are prioritized and specific habitats in each region of the state that are priorities for conservation. For us in northwestern Montana, through the mitigation program that I manage associated with the federal hydropower facilities, lost forest habitat and particularly endangered species like grizzly bears and those things are a priority for us. That's why this kind of project fits. And so yes, we focus on opportunities in areas which this Haskell Basin greater area that I showed you here is all within a priority that we identified in the state action plan. But then the opportunities exist because landowners come to us and say, hey, there's this problem. We've got development on our doorstep. It's worth a ton of money. And I don't want to do this to you people, but I'm going to have to. Let's find a solution.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Alan, can you talk about why Stoltz Company has such a good relationship with the community there?
They've been around for a really long time. As I mentioned, it's right there between Columbia Falls and Whitefish is a big part of the Flathead Valley community, and their land has always been open and available. As a privately family-owned company, they care a lot about the land, and the stewardship is a big part of what they do. So unlike, if it's a publicly traded company, they're focused on stock value and return. The Stoltz family has continued to focus on the health of the watershed and the health of the forest and the tie to the communities. And so they have, once a year, the community throws a thank you appreciation dinner for the Stoltz employees, recognizing that 40,000 acres right on the rim of Flathead Valley could be lost to public access like that if the company decided they could make more money offering exclusive access or just closing access and not dealing with the problems of, high intensity public recreation in the backyard of a community on private land and the liability issues and all of those things associated with it.
In the center?
So with your different easements, besides, what were the funding mechanisms? I mean, you mentioned what this particular one was, but those are some really big easements. What were the funding for the state chip in?
We didn't on this one. Our role in the Haskell Basin project was to first raise the money, to work on the grant applications to get that money in place. And for both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service money, that has to come to our agency. So it has to come through the agency. We could sub-grant it to others, but it's easier that way. And the big role, and honestly the biggest challenge for easements like this is Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is an agency holding and committing to monitor and ensure that the terms of that easement are upheld into the future. And so we visit the property once a year, visit with the landowners. We have public meetings to see if there's any issues or input or that kind of stuff. So to me, that's the big commitment for an easement. It's easy to come up with the money and buy it. It's hard to come up with a commitment to maintain the stewardship and the legal challenge of making sure that everybody in the future is living up to those commitments.
Other questions? No? Okay, well, let's say thank you to Alan